Imagine standing before a stone tower. Not just any tower, a structure built when woolly mammoths still walked the earth, when writing didn't exist, when pottery hadn't even been invented yet. This tower, rising nearly 30 feet into the ancient sky, required 11,000 days of human labor to construct. 11,000 days of coordinated effort by people who had no written language, no complex tools, no wheel, just hands, stone, and an inexplicable drive to build something that reached toward the heavens. This is the Tower of Jericho, and it may be one of the most mysterious structures ever created by human hands. For more than 10,000 years, this tower has stood in the Jordan Valley, its purpose debated, its builders unknown, their language lost forever to time. We don't know their names. We don't know their gods. We don't even know where they came from. But we know they achieved something absolutely astonishing in an age when most humans still wandered the earth as nomadic hunter-gatherers. This tower wasn't alone. It stood at the heart of what may have been the very first city on Earth. A settlement so old, it predates the pyramids by 5,000 years. So ancient, it makes Babylon look modern. So revolutionary, it changed the entire course of human history. The name of that city was Jericho. Here's what we're going to uncover. How one archaeologist's discovery shattered everything we thought we knew about early civilization, the bizarre skull cult that practiced ancestor worship beneath their homes, and the catastrophe that may have wiped out an entire region for over 1,000 years. Stay until the end, because what happened to Jericho reveals a pattern that repeated itself across the ancient world. 6,000 years before the present day, the colossal metropolis of Uruk dominated the southern Mesopotamian plains. With at least 50,000 inhabitants, it was by far the largest city in the world. For 3,000 years, nothing would surpass it in size or population. Uruk represented the pinnacle of early urban civilization, complete with writing, complex social hierarchies, monumental architecture, and sophisticated administrative systems. But Uruk didn't appear out of nowhere. It was simply the latest and most successful in a long chain of experiments in communal living stretching back thousands of years into the Stone Age. More than 5,000 years before Uruk's founding, smaller settlements had begun to coalesce and form across the ancient Near East. These were the very first known examples of static communal living in human history. The first cities on Earth, depending on how you define the term. Among these pioneering settlements, one stands out above all others for its age, its innovations, and its sheer improbability. That settlement was Jericho. Jericho is a place of firsts. Here, 5,000 years before Uruk, we find the first known settlement surrounded by walls, the earliest evidence of cooperation between groups larger than a single clan or kinship, the first significant proof of large-scale communal labor, and when it was first discovered, the earliest known tower complete with internal stairs in human history. What makes this especially striking is that these achievements occurred in a world without writing. Writing wouldn't develop for thousands of years to come. Even pottery didn't exist yet. Nevertheless, these people came together at this ancient oasis and built something extraordinary. This may be one of the first places on Earth where animals were domesticated and agriculture experimented with on a wide scale. All of this was achieved in astonishing 11,000 years before the present, just a few centuries after the end of the last ice age, a time when megafauna still roamed freely across continents, when the world was warming, transforming, offering new possibilities to the scattered bands of humans who had survived the frozen millennia. What makes Jericho even more fascinating is its continuity. Unlike sites such as Uruk, which eventually declined when river courses changed and ecological conditions deteriorated, the spring at Jericho has never dried up. Underground water has fed this oasis continuously for thousands upon thousands of years, meaning people still live here today. The thread of human habitation at Jericho stretches back through recorded history, through the Age of Empires, through the Bronze Age, through the Neolithic Revolution, all the way back to the very dawn of settled life itself. This is the story of Jericho, one of the oldest cities on Earth. a settlement that challenges everything we thought we knew about early human civilization. In January 1951, an airplane descended toward the Middle East. On board sat one of archaeology's rising stars, arriving to investigate one of the most controversial sites in the ancient world. This wasn't just any archaeologist. This was a representative of a new generation of scholars who were revolutionizing their discipline. The 19th century had belonged to adventurers, men like Heinrich Schliemann, the swashbuckling discoverer of Troy, whose methods essentially amounted to bulldozing through layers of ancient cities in search of treasure and glory. Untold amounts of information were discovered during that era, but far more was lost forever, destroyed by crude excavation techniques and a focus on finding spectacular artifacts rather than understanding context. By the mid-20th century, a transformation was underway. New scientific methods pioneered by scholars like the Egyptologist Flinders Petrie were changing everything. The implementation of radiocarbon dating allowed researchers to accurately date their findings for the first time in history. Archaeology was becoming a science, not just an adventure. The archaeologist arriving in the Middle East that January embodied this new approach. Her name was Kathleen Kenyon. She was a student of the famous Mortimer Wheeler and daughter of the director of the British Museum. She had been called to the shores of the Dead Sea to investigate a particularly intriguing and controversial site. This wasn't the first time Jericho had been excavated. 20 years earlier, fellow British archaeologist John Garstang had undertaken a 6-year investigation of the site, eventually concluding it to be the location of the famous walls from the Old Testament. The walls supposedly destroyed by the Israelite commander Joshua, using nothing but trumpets and prayer before launching into the customary sacking and slaughter associated with that period of history. Garstang's conclusions received heavy criticism from the academic community. Now, with the chaos of the Second World War finally subsided, Kenyon had been called in to make her own determination. She approached the site with scientific rigor and an open mind, prepared to challenge the biblical narrative if the evidence demanded it. Unlike many archaeological sites throughout the region, often lost in the desert due to changing river courses or even underwater due to rising sea levels, the geography of Jericho has changed remarkably little since the last ice age. Sitting comfortably between two mountain ranges and the Dead Sea, it rests in a naturally defensible location. More importantly, underground water supplies have fed the oasis here for as long as humans have lived in the region. Modern Jericho stretches over an area of some 15 kilometers, encompassing lush fields and orchards in a seemingly barren landscape. The abundance exists because of those underground water supplies, making this spot a natural magnet for human settlement throughout the ages. The actual excavation work was to be done at a solitary mound rising up over the settlement on one edge of town. Today, it's known as Tel es Sultan. On first glance, it might have appeared to be a naturally occurring hill, especially before archaeological work had been carried out. But it was so much more than that. The hill itself was far from natural. Like all tells throughout the Middle East, it was actually the result of thousands of years of collapsed mud brick architecture. A mountain of debris from previous cities which collapsed were leveled and eventually built over by successive generations across the long millennia. Layer upon layer of human habitation compressed into a single mound of earth and ancient construction materials. As Kenyon approached the site, she knew it was old, but just how old, she nor anyone else had any idea. The techniques Kenyon and her colleagues employed are known as stratigraphic excavation. They meticulously noted soil layers as they dug, dating the various strata of habitation to get an accurate sequence of events. After some initial digging and a re-evaluation of Garstang's conclusions, Kenyon decided there simply wasn't enough evidence to conclusively make the biblical connection. As often happens with archaeology, more digging was needed. Kenyon called in reinforcements. In the following year, a small army of laborers arrived at the site and serious work began. They wouldn't finish until 1958, some 6 years later. By that time, Jericho had become one of the most famous archaeological sites in human history. John Garstang had initially dated the earliest settlements on the site to the 4th millennium before Christ. As far as most scholars at the time were concerned, the widespread domestication of agriculture and animals had only occurred around 1,000 years or so earlier. The timeline seemed relatively straightforward. Humans had been hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, then quite suddenly, around 5,000 years ago, they'd invented agriculture, domesticated animals, built cities, and launched civilization. What Kenyon and her team found would shatter that timeline completely. Habitation had continued at the site for an astonishing 8,000 years, between approximately 9,400 and 1,580 before Christ, with the potential for even earlier occupation too. Though this end date was later amended to around 1400 before Christ and remains debated by scholars today, it doesn't change the overall implications of Kenyon's findings. People had been living at Jericho since the Stone Age, since a time when agriculture was barely understood, since an age when most of humanity still lived in small wandering bands. Perhaps the most astonishing discovery wasn't Garstang's supposed biblical walls at all, but a Neolithic tower built approximately 10,000 years ago. At the time of its discovery, it was the earliest structure of its kind ever known on Earth. But the discovery of the tower was only the beginning, because what Kenyon would uncover about the people who built it and the strange rituals they practiced with human skulls would challenge everything scholars believed about the origins of religion itself. To understand why this discovery was so revolutionary, we need to step back and examine the world as it existed 11,000 years ago. Today, more than half of the world's population lives in cities. Urban life is so normal, we rarely stop to think about how strange it actually is. Millions of people packed together in concrete and steel, completely dependent on complex supply chains for food, water, and every other necessity. But there was once a time when this was unthinkable. Up until around 11,000 years ago, the Earth had been locked in a seemingly endless ice age for eons. 25,000 years ago, conditions reached the coldest point of the last ice age, known as the last glacial maximum. From then on, however, a steady and gradual warming began. Finally, after a brief return to cold conditions known as the Younger Dryas, which may have helped kickstart agriculture out of necessity due to the difficult conditions it ushered in, the entire world returned to its pre-Ice Age warm period. Humans could finally flourish once more. Bands of humans, often called affluent foragers during this period, had previously huddled together for warmth or simply lived much further south. Now they found themselves living in a land of plenty. They hunted game, collected wild plants and grasses, and traveled from region to region, living a nomadic existence that had served humanity well for hundreds of thousands of years. But around 9,500 before Christ, something changed. Groups of these people began to coalesce at natural springs, oases, and particularly abundant rivers in the wide arc of the Middle East known today as the Fertile Crescent. Whether voluntarily or due to environmental pressures remains debated, but these groups began a radical new experiment in human living. They were helped along by the uniqueness of the grasses and seeds in this area. Some could be cultivated and replanted by human hands rather than simply gathered from the wild, providing a nearly inexhaustible food source for the future. Still semi-migratory at first, these bands gradually settled down for good. They experimented with plants and animals to feed their families. Over time, due to population growth and overuse of natural resources, domestication became both possible and necessary. One such site was Jericho, then a large oasis in the Jordan Valley. Underground tributaries perpetually flowed from the Jordan River into the central mountains to the west, making life not only possible, but incredibly fertile due to the unique low geography of the region. Home to an abundance of wild animals and plants, agriculture may have been harnessed here earlier than most other places on the planet. Though Jericho didn't exist in isolation, from its earliest days, the oasis lay at the heart of a thriving system of trading communities scattered throughout the Fertile Crescent. Evidence suggests Jericho was one of the largest of these settlements, if not the largest, but it almost certainly wasn't the earliest, nor the originator of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic culture that would come to dominate the site. Farming and pastoralism began elsewhere. In the 1990s, an archaeological discovery in modern-day southeastern Turkey sent shockwaves through multiple academic disciplines. The site is famous worldwide as Göbekli Tepe, perhaps the first religious center on Earth. This site is thought to have been built and used by numerous bands of affluent foragers, perhaps sharing a common religion and culture. The strange animal figures carved all over the pillars at Göbekli Tepe and even at other neighboring sites throughout the region may be pictographs, a form of primitive hieroglyphics. Though their message remains undeciphered, the site fueled the revolutionary idea that religion, not agriculture, had actually been the catalyst for the birth of civilization. It also left tantalizing clues about the origins of agriculture itself. The very oldest known wild relative of wheat is found not too far from Göbekli Tepe. It's not too much of a stretch to think that some of those at Jericho may have had connections with Göbekli Tepe. Professor Stephen Meathen has even suggested it's possible that after ceremonies undertaken at Göbekli Tepe, travelers would return to their respective tribes with seeds and the knowledge of how to grow them. Work continues at Göbekli Tepe, and we learn more every year. Unfortunately, the similarly ancient and fascinating site of Jurf el Ahmar, perhaps a similar ceremonial center for foragers and contemporary with the earliest stages of settlement at Jericho, now lies under a lake. It was flooded in the 20th century to make way for a reservoir, its secrets drowned forever. This raises a fascinating question. Was religion actually the prime mover in forming the first cities? Perhaps these settlements began as ceremonial centers like Göbekli Tepe, and eventually, over time, as people gathered for rituals, they began to settle down and build permanent communities. It may even be possible that some of the earliest farmers on Earth brought their grain to shrines like these, passing their agricultural secrets on during festivities to other curious groups of foragers. Presumably in return for some other resource, they could have then brought seeds back to their homeland along with other trade goods like the obsidian found at Jericho. Maybe the grain even had a ritualized religious quality? We may never know for sure, but we do know that by around 9000 before Christ, vast changes in stone technology and an entirely new way of life came to the Fertile Crescent. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the moment when people first adopted farming, animal husbandry, and communal living on a permanent basis. The Tower of Jericho, often known simply as the Watchtower, is one of the most extraordinary buildings in human history. Not because of intricate architecture or beautiful decoration, but simply because of its age and what its construction implies about early human society. At around 30 feet in diameter and 28 feet tall, it's estimated to have taken approximately 11,000 days of labor to build. That's 11,000 person days of work. And that figure doesn't include the time spent planning or quarrying resources. When Kenyon first uncovered the tower, it was thought to be the first example of monumental communal architecture on the planet. Built around 8000 before Christ, at a time when the vast majority of humans still lived a nomadic hunter-gatherer existence, its architecture seemed completely unprecedented in both scale and design. The walls are 5 feet thick. An interior staircase leads up to what was once a roof. A significant portion of the community's labor must have been dedicated to its construction, implying a highly organized and motivated society. But this raises a crucial question. What was the purpose of the tower? The settlement it stood at the heart of, part of the culture known today as Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, thrived from around 8500 to 7370 before Christ. It isn't the only settlement in the region. Similar sites exist at places like Netiv, Hagdud, and Dra, but with an area of around 425,000 square feet, Jericho is by far the largest known from this period. Researchers have proposed all sorts of theories about the tower's purpose. Perhaps it was a giant grain storage facility, protecting precious food supplies from vermin and flood. Perhaps it was a defensive structure, guarding against external enemies, an early form of fortification, or even a primitive castle. Perhaps it served all these functions simultaneously. But one of the most convincing arguments, and one which links back to the ceremonial site at Göbekli Tepe, is that the tower served a religious function. The religion of the pre-pottery Neolithic people remains heavily debated. We'll probably never know exactly how it worked, but we can find parallels with other contemporary, earlier, and later sites throughout the region. Some scholars, such as Mari G. Mbutas, see evidence of a mother goddess cult holding sway over the Fertile Crescent, interpreted through sculptures and artwork found across the region. Some have even argued this religious belief inspired the leap to agriculture itself. Yet this interpretation remains controversial. Others argue for male animalistic deities, often depicted with prominent phalluses, on sites such as Göbekli Tepe. The horns of wild cattle, buried underneath houses at Pre-Pottery Neolithic Jericho, might be related to this animal cult. The tower itself contains tantalizingly little direct evidence of its purpose. There's no pottery here, no bones or burials underneath it. It's not physically linked to the other fortifications or buildings at the site. Yet what else but religion, the very worldview of these people, could have motivated such a massive construction project? Perhaps the tower facilitated accurate observations of the sky, both stars and the sun, or even their worship. It might have functioned as both observatory and temple simultaneously. We know that in later ages, shrines and sanctuaries of deities were often built on raised platforms to get closer to the heavens. This pattern appears throughout the ancient Americas and even in the Greek and Roman world. The augurs on the Capitoline Hill observed birds to divine the future from their elevated position. This tradition even survived into early Christianity, with late classical ascetics living atop giant pillars to commune with God. Could the Tower at Jericho be an early example of this widespread tradition? And if so, who exactly was doing the communing? Who was taking on the role of intermediary between the community below and the gods above? At the similar but slightly later site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey, priest kings are thought to have controlled city life. This was certainly a tradition utilized by later Sumerian cities such as Uruk and Eridu, places with extremely prominent sky gods in their religions. Perhaps here at Jericho 10,000 years ago, shamanistic priest kings directed rituals from the top of the tower. By ascending the internal staircase, they could get closer to the other world, facilitating communication with the divine. This might have been a leftover tradition that their cultural descendants would continue to utilize for 10 millennia to come. As far as most people were concerned, that was that. Jericho had the oldest tower on Earth. The story seemed complete. Then, in 1999, without even particularly looking for it, a joint Polish-Syrian team found something astonishing not too far from the modern city of Aleppo. Once again, history would be rewritten, pushing the dates back by thousands of years. At Tel Karemel in modern-day Syria, the team found not just one similar tower to Jericho, but 5 of them, possibly dating to an astonishing 2,000 years earlier than Jericho's tower, perhaps as early as 10,000 before Christ. This makes the site roughly contemporary with the ritual center at Göbekli Tepe. The implications are staggering. Is tower building a long-lost tradition that once held sway all over the region, surviving now in only 2 places? Why did Tel Karemel have 5 towers rather than 1? Were they used for the same functions as Jericho's tower? Did more of them exist at other yet undiscovered sites, or at locations already demolished or built over by later civilizations? So far, as of 2019, only around 2% of Tel Karemel has been uncovered. Unfortunately, with the outbreak of war in Syria in 2007, excavations were put on near-permanent suspension. Only the future can tell what other secrets lie hidden beneath the earth, just waiting to be rediscovered. A city is usually defined as a place containing both living quarters as well as religious and civic buildings. The tower at Jericho may have served as both of the latter, sharing a religious as well as societal function by binding together the people of the region with a common cause. When first discovered, the tower was almost immediately associated with the biblical story of Joshua, the early Israelite warlord, said to have torn down the walls of the city using only trumpets and prayer. Of course, the tower is far too early to be connected in any way to the Bible. Interestingly, it also seems unconnected to the defensive works surrounding the Neolithic settlement, which do include a ditch and a wall. Yet these defensive works themselves may not have been built to defend against external enemies at all. They may have been constructed to protect against natural flash floods which regularly beset the region. If you live in a mud brick house, flooding and the natural world are as much your enemy as outsiders. Perhaps more so, especially during this time when settlements of Jericho's size were nearly unheard of elsewhere in the world. The similarly ancient city of Çatalhöyük, for example, which reached its height slightly later than Jericho, has rather unorthodox architecture. It has no streets at all. Houses are only accessible via ladders onto the roofs. Settled life there may have begun in part to protect against attacks from wild animals. The natural world was still very much at the forefront of life at these early settlements. Though some animals may have been on the road to domestication, the main source of meat still seems to have been wild gazelle. The people of early Jericho were experimenting with domestication, but not on a huge scale yet. They were still living a mostly forager lifestyle, but from a sedentary position. The remains of gazelle, cattle, boar, sheep, and goat have been found at Jericho. Some of these may have been domesticated, though evidence is scarce. It remains difficult to differentiate between wild and domesticated animals in the archaeological record from this period. Maybe wild animals were being trapped and kept as food reserves. A wild animal can be kept in an enclosure and fed before being eaten. It doesn't have to be fully domesticated. True domestication takes a long time and many generations of selective breeding. The other major food source for these people was agricultural produce, including wheat, barley, peas, and beans, all of which had been gradually adapted from wild ancestors through careful selection and cultivation. The people at Jericho lived in round houses, around 14 feet in diameter, with sunken mud plaster floors. Each dwelling seems to have been pretty much identical, each with their own grain storage area. This suggests that every household had control of their own food supply, quite possibly being independent in terms of food production. This is very different from later Sumerian cities such as Uruk, where the priestly class held a deliberate monopoly over food production, and society itself was highly stratified. At early Jericho, there seems to have been much more equality. The houses at Jericho also seem to be scattered somewhat randomly throughout the site, each perhaps occupied by a distinct family or kinship group. Perhaps each descended from the various tribes who had first come to the city to work together all those centuries before. Rather than being grouped by profession and class like in later Sumerian cities, people seem to have been organized around tribal or kinship houses. This suggests little social distinction and differentiation between the lowest and highest levels of society. Many scholars think Jericho began rather spontaneously, with no central organizational structure. Perhaps it was built from the ground up by forager groups cooperating for mutual benefit, rather than deliberately planned by priest-kings like the later Sumerian cities. After all, writing, the key to Uruk's administrative success, doesn't appear for another 4,000 or 5,000 years. Pottery hadn't even been invented yet at early Jericho. Once thought to have been something of an anomaly, a strange one-off settlement, in recent years other similar settlements have been discovered in the West Bank region. All share a similar culture, often called Natufian, with the only major difference being Jericho's massive size, sprawling over a 10-acre area. Could these be outlying settlements of Jericho, part of a larger political or economic network? Or are they simply related sites, separated by geography, but linked up in a shared economic and cultural sphere? We know from archaeological finds that Jericho enjoyed widespread trade links with various other sites throughout the Fertile Crescent. Obsidian, an especially sharp volcanic rock from Asia Minor useful for making blades, was a particularly prized material that had to be imported from hundreds of miles away. During this ancient time, Jericho was almost certainly the focal point of this entire region. Its oasis was simply far more abundant than its neighbors. It may have functioned as a trading hub, a religious center, and a population center all at once. Yet with great prosperity always comes a price. Pre-Pottery Neolithic, a Jericho lasted until somewhere around 7300 to 700 before Christ, at which time the tell appears to have been abandoned. Much of the town wall collapsed, the top of the tower eroded away. The site fell silent. We don't know what ended the first city at Jericho. All manner of conclusions have been drawn from the limited evidence: earthquake, pestilence, outside invasion, decline in soil fertility, climate change, or perhaps all of the above working in combination. Yet within just a couple of lifetimes, in a situation that would eventually become endemic over the long millennia at this site, a new city would arise on top of the old. And what this new culture did with the skulls of their dead would haunt the archaeological imagination for generations to come. One of the most iconic finds at Jericho dates not to the pre-Pottery Neolithic A period of the Watchtower, but to the next settlement to arise in the city's long history. A new culture that seems to have taken over the entire region, perhaps after a brief period of decline and abandonment. Whether the pre-Pottery Neolithic B culture arose as the result of internal change or an external invasion, we can't be certain, but we know far more about their material culture than their predecessors.